and we need to come up with an electoral system that works the best for South Africa. And if that is going to include some additional costs, whether it's additional ballot papers or voter education, I think that's what we have to do.
Is South Africa's electoral system fit for purpose? Is our democracy truly representative? Well, joining me to discuss these questions is Marius Roodt. He is a writer and analyst with the Institute of Race Relations. Marius Roodt, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks, David. Nice to be here.
So, Marius, you are the author of the IRR's submission to the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs in Parliament, which is reviewing this draft legislation. There is the Electoral Amendment Bill, which is before Parliament, which is proposing a number of changes to our electoral system. But before we get into that, could you describe to our audience today, what is the structure of the current system, the proportional representation system that we currently have?
Well, in South Africa, we basically have two different electoral systems. We use one system at national and provincial level, and then a separate system at municipal level. So what we're talking about today will be the system we use to elect our representatives to Parliament and to the non-provincial legislatures. So at that level, we have a pure proportional representation system. So what happens there is when you go on voting day, you vote for a political party to represent you. And what happens is, whatever party, if you get 20% of the votes on election day, that means you get 20% of the seats. People don't vote for an individual to represent them, they vote for a political party. And then the various political parties they'll send whatever the case may be. So in our system, if you win 20% of the vote, you'll get 80 representatives in Parliament. It's obviously different going by the various provincial legislatures, depending how many people represent you, or how many seats are in the various provincial legislatures. But that's basically what it comes down to. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to the system. One of the advantages, obviously, it's proportional, which is, it reflects the views of the voters very well. In other systems, what they call first past the post, or the Westminster system used in the UK, it's used in India, it's used for the House of Representatives in the United States. It was a system we used prior to 1994. That is when you vote for an individual to represent your particular area to send you to Parliament. Problem with that system is it can often lead to distorted outcomes. A very good example is from South Africa in 1948, when the National Party won the election, even though they'd won nearly 10 percentage points fewer than Jan Smuts and the United Party. But because of how the system was designed and worked out, depending how your votes were spread around the country, you could actually win more seats than a party who actually won more votes than you. So that is one of the advantages of this system. As I said, it reflects the will of the voters quite closely. It's the system we decided to go for in 1994 because it allows a lot of smaller parties to get into Parliament. It allows people with minorities and so on to get into Parliament. We've seen in the most recent election, Al Jamaa, which is a party based on Islamic principles and so on. They got to Parliament with one seat with only 30,000 votes and about 0.2% of the vote. So as I say, it's a very inclusive system, but there are some problems with it too. As I say, you don't directly vote for somebody to represent you. You simply vote for a political party, and political parties will decide on who will go represent you in Parliament. So that what often happens with that then is that party bosses have control over their members of Parliament. And we've seen this that often leads to a break between the oversight of the legislature over the executive. We've all seen what happened, during the Jacob Zuma years, where there was quite a big reluctance on the part of the ANC MPs to take on the executive, primarily, obviously, President Jacob Zuma. But things haven't really changed on President Ramaphosa. The ANC doesn't really act as a watchdog over the executive. It's still pretty much a rubber stamp. And that is one of the primary problems with the system. Just as a side note, we use a different system at municipal level. This is where you get two votes at municipal level. You get one vote to select somebody to represent your particular ward. in the municipal council, you get another vote for a political party. So that means that, and that shows that there's also proportionality in the municipal council, but there are also people who represent a particular area in that, in your city or in your town. And so that is one of the things that we need to look at with the current electoral system. What is best for South Africa, and should we move away from the current proportional representation system?
Okay, so one of the shortcomings of the PR system is that it gives party bosses this disproportionate power, whereas in the UK, you might have, say, rebel backbencher MPs, like Jeremy Corbyn was one such MP for many years. He was a hard socialist, even during the Blairite years, which were much more centre-left. And so he had an independent constituency, an independent voice, was often quite critical of the government, even though he was from the same party. But here in South Africa, as you point out, it's very easy for the whips to crack the whip, and most of the MPs just toe the line. But in the UK, the first past the post system has its own shortcomings. I mean, I lived in the UK from 2009 to 2010, and for some reason I was eligible to vote in the general elections there. And I was living in Bethnal Green and Bow, and that constituency, I voted for the Liberal Democrats at the time, but the Labour candidate ended up winning. The Labour candidate got about 20,000 votes. The Liberal Democrat got 10,000 votes. And all of those 10,000 votes essentially just vanished into thin air. There was no representation for those 10,000 votes. So, that strikes me as also a flaw in that first past the post system.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of votes are wasted in the first past the post system, as you point out. And as I noted earlier with the 1948 results here in South Africa, a party with fewer votes than another party can actually end up winning an election, or a party can win a minority of overall votes and still win a majority in parliament. We've actually seen that. That's the current outcome in the UK. This is actually something that happens regularly in the UK. It's very rare that a party wins more than 50% of the overall vote, although the governing party will often win a majority of the seats in Westminster, when the House of Commons. I think since World War II, it's only happened once that the party that came first actually won less than 50% of the seats in Parliament. I think that was in 2010 when David Cameron was Prime Minister, and he had to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And as I mentioned, I think Theresa May had to do the same in 2017. She also had to go into coalition, into sort of a confidence and supply agreement with, I think was one of the Ulster parties. I think it was the Ulster Unions Party, I think. But anyways, but it's quite rare in the UK that it happens. But it leads to, as I say, distorted outcomes. A party can win 30% of the votes and win over 50% of the seats in Parliament. We've seen actually something that's happened now in Canada. I'm sure a lot of your viewers are quite familiar with what's been happening in Canada recently, but Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party, they've actually come second in the last two elections in terms of votes, but they came first in terms of seats in Parliament. So Justin Trudeau, he's only winning about not even a third of the total vote in Canada, but his party's been in government since then, and we've seen he seems to be a fairly unpopular guy now, perhaps even more unpopular than when he had in the last two elections. So it leads to certainly some distorted outcomes. But that said, people do have an MP that represents their area in Parliament. People, if they have an issue, they can write to the MP. Petitions or petition the MP for certain things that are going on there. And also what happens also in the UK, it's not that common, but it happens in Westminster or first past the post systems. Often an MP will arise as an independent who's standing on a single issue as a single issue candidate. And we've seen often what happens in the UK. There'll be a large hospital closing the constituency, and somebody will come and they'll run the single platform they'll be running on is to not let that hospital close. And they'll, just as an example, and they will then be elected to Parliament, and they'll be fighting for that. So in South Africa, unfortunately, we don't have that in a proportional representation system. You don't really see local issues come to the fore when you are voting for on parliamentary level. And also, in theory, South African parliamentarians do have a constituency. They do. I know the Democratic Alliance definitely assigns their various MPs a constituency, but nobody knows who their MP is, and it's not too sure how many people actually use this this possibility to write the MP, but problems in their local area. And as far as I know, the ANC doesn't assign constituencies to their MPs. So at South Africa, I think there could be a lot more linkage between MPs and local communities which they purportedly represent. And this is one of the reasons why there has been a move to amend South Africa's electoral system.
Okay, Marius, well, let's talk about that in more detail. There has been this constitutional court case, and the judgment came out, was it last year or already?
2020.
2020. Forgive me, I'm losing track of time with COVID. But you know, and that essentially mandated Parliament to amend the Electoral Act. We now have this proposed draft legislation, and you have drafted this proposal, the submission to the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee to express concerns with that. But let's start at the beginning. What was the Constitutional Court's directives in terms of its judgment?
So the background to it is, I think there was an organization called the New Nation Movement. They brought a court challenge to the, I'm not sure where it started, but it ended in the Constitutional Court, saying that individuals at the moment cannot stand, or individuals or independents, wherever you want to characterize it, cannot stand for Parliament or any of the provincial legislatures. As I said earlier, at ward level or at municipal level, you can, because you can stand as an individual in your particular ward and run for the council, but you can't do that at Parliament, for Parliament or the provincial legislatures. So that was the court challenge that was brought. It was, I think basically what it came down to was that it was going against somebody's freedom of association, because while we are free to associate with anybody we want, we should also be free to not associate. And as it stands now, you have to be a member of a political party to stand for Parliament or any of the non-provincial legislatures. And that's basically what this ruling came down to. The Constitutional Court said that Parliament had to amend the legislation within 2 years. So the deadline's coming up now in June this year. And to be honest, the Parliament and the Home Affairs and so on, they've been dragging their feet quite significantly. There's been some work done on it, but there's only parliamentary hearings now, and this legislation has to be finalized within 3 months. And we're still having parliamentary hearings at the moment. We haven't had any public hearings. So it's going to be a very tight race, I think, to get this legislation completed. And it has to be done, it's all going to be done very soon, because we need to give the IEC time, depending on whatever system we finally decide to go to. Everything's got to be finalized by later, say, September next year, because we have an election that's going to have to be held by about the middle of 2024. So all kinds of things have to be finalized fairly soon, whether it's constituency boundaries, ballot papers, a new electoral system, or whatever the case may be. So things have been left for quite long, to be honest, and it's quite a failing on the part of Parliament.
All right, so there are some procedural problems there with the consultation process, but what about the proposal itself? What is the detail that's on the table there?
So what's happened is the new electoral amendment, it's basically gone for, it's meeting the letter of the constitutional ruling, but not meeting the spirit of it. What it's basically proposing is to just bolt independence onto a proportional representation system. So what it's been proposed is that the 9 provinces will be broken into basically what will be 9 multi-member constituencies. And people will be able to stand in these various constituencies. 200 seats, 200 parliamentary seats will be elected from the 9 constituencies, obviously depending on the population of each province. It'll depend how many parliamentarians are sent to Parliament, whether it's in Cape Town or who knows who's going to be following what happened in January. But independents will be able to stand in these in the 9 multi-member constituencies, which is basically the 9 provinces, but they'll be running against political parties at the same time. But this is a bit of a logical nonsense. It's basically making independence, it's adding independence to a proportional representation system without actually allowing independents or individuals to stand in a way that makes it fair and makes it and puts independence on the same footing as a political party. It'll lead to some rather distorted outcomes. It's probably going to break proportionality, which is a big problem because the only requirement in the constitution for our electoral system is that it's in general proportional. This is not going to happen with the current system. And another issue is that we're going to have 200 seats elected from the 9 provinces. We're going to have another 200 seats, which are called compensatory systems in the legislature, excuse me. And that's another 200 seats, and these are going to be decided on using proportional representation. However, these compensatory seats are going to be calculated without taking into account the votes for independents. So it'll actually be a political party could actually get a seat in parliament with fewer votes than an independent gained in the same election. So that's simply not fair. At the same time, independents aren't going to be, they're not going to be allowed to gain, what's the word I'm looking for, more than 1 seat. So for example, if a political party receives, say, 200,000 votes, and that is equal to 4 seats in parliament, if that same independent gets 200,000 votes, they are only entitled to the 1 vote or the 1 seat in parliament for themselves. So that's going to lead to a lot of wasted votes, which is going to be a problem in our proportional representation system. As I say, it's going to break proportionality. And there's a whole bunch of other issues with the legislation, with the proposed formula to work out the quota of seats and so on. It disadvantages independents, which is, it's simply not fair to independents, people who want to run. And it's something that definitely has to be considered. There's also some other problems. Independents have to, when they want to stand, they're going to have to jump through some hoops that somebody running on a political party list is not going to have to do. They're going to have to get a certain amount of signatures to allow them to stand. Obviously, somebody who's standing for a political party won't have to do that. Another issue, as the legislation stands, is that if an independent resigns or dies or resigns from parliament, they aren't going to have to, there won't be any by-election, and that person won't be replaced. You obviously can't replace somebody without a by-election. You can't just make, if they were elected as an independent. So that's another problem. So there are some serious flaws with this legislation. If you also look at how the quota is calculated, as the proposed quota for the legislation is different from the current quota, the current formula that we use to elect parliamentarians. And this will actually, how it stands now is that larger parties could actually benefit from the new legislation. It's quite possible now, according to some people who've done the maths on this, that a party like the ANC could actually, as it currently stands, get 20 or 30 seats more than they would be entitled to from the overall vote share because of the new formula and because of the way independents are being disadvantaged. So that is also going to break proportionality, and it's actually quite a big problem. And it's something that's, a lot of people have raised concerns. And it all comes down to that Parliament dragged its feet. It's left things to the last minute. And that's why it's made this, frankly, it's an unworkable solution. And it's going to cause some problems. I foresee that there's probably going to be constitutional court challenges to it because, as I say, it's breaking proportionality, which is the only requirement in the constitution for our electoral system. So, it's a very big problem. And I think we're going to see some fights ahead on this.
So, Marius, I'm a big fan of the mental model of Hanlon's razor, which is don't attribute to malice what can be ascribed to incompetence. Do you think that there could be perhaps a malicious intent here? Or how does this serve the current political establishment to be making these proposals? Or do you think it's just that this has been a typical South African muddle through without considering the kind of secondary consequences?
I think it's the latter. I don't think there's been any malicious intent with this kind of thing. I think it's simply just been people who've drafted this legislation and the proposal that have come up with it have simply not applied their minds to it. They've gone for the easiest solution. And on this point, the Ministerial Advisory Committee, which looked at this last year, it actually came up with 2 proposals. The first is, which is actually the minority proposal too, is this current proposal. And a secondary proposal was to basically scale up the system we use at municipal level to national and provincial level. But the issue with that would have to be a demarcation of constituencies and boundaries and so on. We'd also have to print more ballot papers because as it stands now with the proposed system, you'd get the same number of ballot papers as you get at national and provincial levels now. National and provincial elections. You'd get one ballot paper for the National Assembly, one ballot paper for your provincial legislature. But with the secondary system that was the Ministerial Advisory Committee received, they'd have to receive 4 ballot papers. You receive a ballot paper to vote to elect an individual in your national constituency, then another one to vote for political party, and the same for your provincial legislature. So you'd get also 2 ballot papers, would be 4. So I think it's just, looking for the easiest and cheapest way to do this thing. And we've seen what's happened. It's a bit of a disaster. And as I say, I do not see how this legislation will be passed. It's simply unconstitutional, and it's just a massive waste of time. And I do know Parliament's already, I'm not sure if they already have asked for extension, but I know they would like to ask for an extension to get this legislation finalized. And to me, I think it's impossible that it'll be finalized by June, especially if we still have to have your general public hearings. So yeah, I don't think there's anything malicious behind this. I just think it's your normal South African incompetence, looking for the easiest and cheapest way out. And we've seen, and what, as we know, if you penny wise, then you often pound foolish.
Okay, so under the current draft legislation, you would have these 9 mixed member constituencies. But what you just referred to, that's something separate. That will be a multi-member proportional system, which would be similar to what we have at the local level. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah, that's it. And that's also the system that's used in Germany, New Zealand, Lesotho. So it's not a case of reinventing the wheel. And people in South Africa are familiar with it because we use it at a municipal level. And I know there have been some concerns that there'll be some confusion and so on with voters, but I think we do South African voters a disservice. I think some people may disagree with me, but I think maybe South African voters are more intelligent than some people would give them credit for. And also, at the same time, democracy is expensive, and if we need voter education to make sure people understand the system, then that's what we've got to do. Elections are expensive. It would obviously be much cheaper to just do away with elections, but we know we can't do that. And we need to come up with an electoral system that works the best for South Africa. And if that is going to include some additional costs, whether it's additional ballot papers or voter education, I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah, look, I also think that it's important that the electoral system is not too opaque, that ordinary citizens can, with relative ease, understand the system. Because if it's too convoluted a process, I think you maybe undermine that trust in the electoral system. You break that accountability relationship between constituents and members of parliament. So I do think that it is good to simplify it as much as possible, but I do take your point, around costs and so on. But now, if we cast our minds back to 2003, that was when the Van Slabbert Commission, which was looking into electoral reform, submitted its report. That was essentially at the behest of Thabo Mbeki, who later basically shelved the report and let it gather dust. But the intention during the constitutional transition was that the PR system that we still have today was going to be a temporary system. What was contained in that proposal by Van Slabbert, and why wasn't that adopted? And could there be any lessons there for us today as we go through this review process?
Yeah, I think the Van Slabbert Commission report, to my mind, its proposal was excellent. And what it proposed effectively was we'd still have the same number of MPs. We'd have 400 MPs, but 300 would be elected from multi-member constituencies. There'd be 69 in the country, and each multi-member constituency would elect between 3 and 7 representatives to go to Parliament. Obviously, depending on the particular constituency, how many people would represent them. I think on average, most constituencies would have about 4 people, but then that's besides the point. And then, as I said, there'd be 300 MPs elected from these 69 multi-member constituencies, and then an additional 100 MPs would be elected from proportional party lists to ensure that there'd be proportionality. From the modelling that the Van Slabbert Commission did at the time, if they'd used that system, it would have mirrored the outcome of the 1999 election completely. So there wouldn't have been any, would have been exactly the same on a pure proportional representation system. So it's certainly something to look at. I think that is probably what we're going to end up with at some point. I think maybe not the exact Van Slabbert Commission proposals, but something along those lines, and also raise something similar on that manner. I'm not too sure why the whole issue was shelved, but if you look at polling and articles from the time from 2003, 2004, people were pretty happy with the electoral system as it stood. So maybe there's also a feeling that, we didn't have to fix something that wasn't broken. But what we have seen in recent times is that there is a lack of trust, and this trust is declining in lots of South Africa's institutions, which includes parliaments and the various opposition parties. And I think that's something, this obviously reforming the electoral system isn't going to be a silver bullet, but I think it's going to go some way to, getting people more engaged in the political process, which is important. I think something that we need to raise is that political participation in elections has been declining for the past few years. Last year's local government election, I think only 30% of eligible South Africans actually turned out to vote. And then we've seen similar trends in national elections. In 2019 was the lowest turnout ever for post-apartheid election. So there's definitely something to watch. But I think, as I say, this isn't a panacea or a silver bullet, but it will go some way to getting South Africans more engaged in the political process.
All right, Marius. Well, in terms of all of the options that we've spoken about, which of these kind of mirror the Van Slabbert recommendations of 2003? And, where can we kind of pick the best components from what's on the table?
Yeah, so there's also another proposal from Monsieur Lekorte and Musi Maimane. Monsieur Lekorte put forward a private members bill, which is very similar to the Van Slabbert Commission proposals. Effectively, they break South Africa up into 52 constituencies, multi-member constituencies, which would mirror South Africa's 52 districts. So, for example, Cape Town as a metro is also a district, so that would be a constituency, or district. Zululand district would be one in KwaZulu-Natal, or Moses Kotane in Northwest, or whatever the case might be. They've also proposed that each voter would receive 2 ballots, one for election from the constituency to the National Assembly, and another for a political party to ensure proportionality. So what would happen? People would be able to basically rank who they want to vote for. You could vote for, you'd still be able to vote for an individual, even if they're a member of a political party. But so it's quite similar to the single transferable vote, where you basically rank your various candidates, and excess votes for candidates who has reached the threshold for a particular constituency is then redistributed to other candidates. However, what would be different from the Musi Maimane and Monsieur Lekorte proposals is that your surplus votes wouldn't actually be decided by the voters. What would happen is that the candidates who haven't made it to Parliament, or if they've reached the quota, they would say that their surplus votes, they will nominate other candidates to receive their surplus votes. So instead of allowing this, leaving this decision in the hands of the voters, it is still left in the hands of politicians to a degree, which is, I think, a bit of a weakness in the Lekorte and Maimane proposal. But overall, I think their proposal is quite a solid proposal. As I say, it's quite similar to the Van Slabbert Commission proposals, and it's definitely something that should be looked at. And I think what we should also be looking at is the proposals for where we basically scale up the municipal electoral system up to our national and provincial level. As I said, South Africans, I think, understand that system already. It wouldn't be reinventing the wheel to do it. And as I said, it's something that's already used around the world. It's used in Germany, New Zealand, Lesotho. So I don't see a problem being used down in South Africa. So there's a multiplicity of systems that South Africa can look at, and we certainly can't use the current proposal that is the current Electoral Amendment Bill. It simply doesn't pass muster. It's not a good system. And there's just, as I say, there's so many other proposals out there that work much better, and which will also meet not only the letter of the Constitutional Court ruling, but also the spirit of it. And I think it's something important. And, electoral reform is not something we should take lightly. And also elections, a democracy is more than voting every 4 or 5 years, but elections are one of the best ways for people to have their voices heard. And, even the ANC actually takes note of how people vote. And, we can't predict what will be happening in the future, but at the moment, the ANC does listen to voters, and this is the best way to make your voice heard, I think.
All right, Marius. Well, one of the recurring themes on this show is that of decentralization, federalism, and the benefits of that, of devolving power down to the local level. I mean, I think this discussion is important around including independence, but I think maybe more important is, well, how do we empower individuals and communities more at that local level? Do you think that electoral reform could achieve that, or would that necessitate maybe a broader discussion around the kind of our institutional arrangements and the kind of quasi-federal structure that's in place in the South African Constitution at the moment? What are your reflections on how to get things more local?
Yeah, I think South Africa's missed two tricks in its history by not federalizing. In 1910, during Union, I think South Africa would have been far better suited to having a federal system. And I think again in 1994, South Africa would have been, federalism works better for a big, complex country like South Africa with lots of different, racial groups, different languages, very big differences in regions around South Africa. So I think federalism is definitely something that we should have implemented in our past. And I think perhaps it's something that we might see in the future. At the moment, we know that ANC is it's quite a centralist organization. And I think that's the character of what's trying to impose that kind of character on South Africa as a whole, which, perhaps it's done well as it's managed to do. But I think we've seen as the hold of the center, hold of Pretoria starts slipping around the country, I think we're going to see this kind of thing happen organically. We've already seen how Cape Town is going to be producing its own electricity. I believe Ekurhuleni, where I stay, is also actually thinking of doing the same thing. And I think I'm open to correction, but I think this was even starting to be spoken about when the ANC was still in charge of the municipality. So even before the DA-led coalition took over. So I think it's the kind of thing that's going to happen organically. But at the same time, local communities, they also need to have some kind of ability to be able to run their own affairs. As I understand, what happens in Spain is that the various, I'm not sure if they have provinces or states in Spain, but each, let's call it province for argument's sake for this discussion, the more capable that particular province is, the more control it has over its own affairs. So I think an example in South Africa would be perhaps Gauteng in the Western Cape would have more control of their own affairs. The two richest provinces, probably the provinces with the most skills, probably best infrastructure and so on. Then other places which have lagged behind, Limpopo and Eastern Cape would perhaps have less control of their own affairs. And we've already seen those provinces have been put under administration and been governed from the center through our history, or since 1994 on different occasions. So I think that's something that's we could look at in the future. So while I think federalism is something that'll probably happen organically in South Africa, whether it's the de facto or de jure, it's definitely, as South Africa continues to decline, unfortunately, so I think it's something that will happen. But we've already seen that local communities are already taking a lot of this kind of thing in their own hands. I mean, around the country, we've seen local communities go to court to take over the running of the municipality or take over, the finances of the area. But, that's also an uphill battle. I believe that there have been courts where they've reversed those decisions. And we know that the ANC it's an organization that likes holding on to power and, governing from the center. So, I think while the ANC is in charge, which I don't think is going to be for too much longer, it's going to be difficult to devolve more power to local communities. But I think that's the way to do it. And I think we've seen around the world, this might be a bit of a generalization, but I think generalization. But countries where there's more federalism and communities have greater control over their own affairs often do better. And it's a paradox. But if you allow federalism, it actually creates more loyalty to the center. I mean, I think India is a very good example. Since independence in, I think it was 1947, something like 6 or 7 new states have been formed in India, because people India, even though that's a majority Hindu country, they still have large minorities of Muslims and Christians and so on. And I believe the state of Nagaland in northeast India, that is a Christian majority state. I think it's got 80 or 90% Christian, but it's a new state, and people there can govern themselves in the way they want to be governed. They're still part of India. They still follow the laws of India, but they're a Christian majority state. They can follow their own traditions and rules and so on. And, that's part of the reason why India, despite a lot of odds, has managed to hold together, obviously apart from partition in 1946 and 47 and so on. But it's a country of over 1 billion people, lots of different faiths and creeds and languages, but it's managed to hold itself together. It's 1.3 billion people. And there's an argument to be made. The reason it's held itself together is because of federalism and democracy.
Yeah, and India is by no means a perfect, stable society. But I think it is a miracle that it's been able to continue and to succeed in many respects for the last 70 years or so. I think empowering local communities and giving people the space to pursue their own political objectives and to structure their institutional arrangements that fits them, I think is very important. Marius, how do you think democracy in South Africa is faring? I mean, do you think that citizens in South Africa feel like their vote matters? And what is the consequence of this declining voter participation in your view?
Yeah, I think it's quite a big problem because if people decide that they can't make their voice heard at the ballot box and they check out the political process, then governments, whether it's provincial, national, or municipal, they lose legitimacy. And, you need the consent of the governed. And if people are deciding that they're not consenting to be governed anymore because they feel that the political process doesn't work for them anymore, it can lead to big problems down the line. If you compare ourselves to other African countries and a lot of other places around the world, South Africans still have high levels of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of expression. I think in a lot of other countries, somebody like Julius Malema or John Steenhuisen would be sitting in jail now, would have had to go into exile for their opposition to the government and the kinds of things that they say. And I think that's something we can be proud of as a country. But I do think this declining participation in elections is a problem. And we've already seen, this is not a new phenomenon in South Africa where we have violent protests. And I think it's often because people feel like their voice isn't heard and they feel like the only way they can be heard is through violence. You don't necessarily have to condone it, but I think you can understand it.
Right, Marius. Well, by way of closing, what recommendations would you have to our audience who are listening and wondering, well, how can they better strengthen democracy? If democracy is something they care about, how do you get involved in building a more kind of democratic culture in South Africa?
Well, I think one way is to get involved with your various community organizations, community policing forums and so on, and also to make sure that your ward councillor knows that they are noticed, making sure, writing to them when there's problems in your community. But I also think what people can do is support organizations such as the Institute of Race Relations and other civil society organizations who fight for people's rights in South Africa. I think it's not exaggeration to say that without civil society, that the last year's election wouldn't have gone ahead. Some of your listeners may remember that the last year's local government election was almost postponed, and for quite, it wasn't very solid reasons because of, it was claimed because of COVID and all kinds of things. But the Institute of Race Relations, amongst others, fought against this, through the use of petitions in the courts, through the media, and the election was held on time when it should have been. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the election would have been postponed without civil society. So I think people should support organizations such as the Institute, other organizations. And I think we've seen the ANC retreating on some bad policy proposals. I think expropriation without compensation is a good example. I think without organizations such as ourselves, it's quite possible that legislation about EWC would have been passed already at this stage. But with the ANC seeing that there's a groundswell of opposition to it and bad policy, it often pulls back on this kind of legislation. And that's why, as I say, people mustn't think that they're just kind of a small boat being buffeted on this big ocean. There's people out there that can support them, and they also need support of people. But also, don't just sit at home, go out and vote. Go make sure your ward councillors listen to you. When there's public hearings on an issue, go there. And also, as I say, I think quite importantly is go support civil society organizations such as ourselves or other organizations.
Marius Roodt, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. We'll put a link in the show notes to your parliamentary submission regarding the Electoral Amendment Bill, and we will also link to the Institute of Race Relations website. So if you would like to donate to the IRR, you can do so via that route. But Marius, just wanted to thank you again very much for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks a lot, David. It was nice to be here.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, if you are listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.